For player profiles, in-depth features, and exclusive interviews, visit sfhandbook.com to learn more about the best young football players in the world. Hello, welcome back to the Scouted Football Podcast. It's transfer season. Today we'll be discussing 4 players from Argentina, a few with some transfer subplots to them, 4 under-23s who over the past 12 months have really demonstrated their potential, their top-line ability, and are names many of you may be unfamiliar with but will need to be quite soon. The headline for this episode is, of course, Julián Álvarez. He's heading over from River Plate to Manchester City, and it has the feel of a potentially big transfer, especially after the year he's had in Argentina. There are also 3 other players who we'll get onto, as well as discussing the route out of South America, including to MLS in the United States, which has been a fairly common step to take in recent seasons. Firstly, though, I'm delighted to welcome Peter Coates, editor of Galatzo Argentino, to the Scouted Podcast. Peter, how are things?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Joe. Thanks very much for having me on, and always a pleasure to be talking about more young players coming out of Argentina.
Yeah, absolutely. I touched on it there, and with Galatzo Argentino, you know, what is it that you do there? Obviously, you're the editor of that site, but what's the role?
Yeah, it started off really as just a hobby when I had moved here, and just started obviously watching a lot of football and writing about what I was watching really, and then that kind of led into other stuff within football. So that ended up being writing for some newspapers about stories usually surrounding Argentina, and then that in turn led to doing some scouting work for clubs who were looking for players in Argentina and South America, and then ultimately over the last couple of years doing quite a lot of commentary work for the Argentine TV in the United States, and also for the Copa Libertadores and Copa Sudamericana. So it's kind of been all off the back of starting Golazo and the Twitter and everything, and from there it's really just blossomed into this much bigger footballing work than I would have imagined when I started it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds all-encompassing, really. Lots of various different endeavours there, but obviously all sort of based around Argentinian football. And anybody who's vaguely familiar with Argentine football will know that vast swathes of talented players who we're more familiar with over in Europe will obviously have started out there and begun their careers there. Do you have, from your time doing work with Golazo, do you have any favourite tales, ones where you've maybe watched elite players before they've made their moves abroad or to Europe, and sort of you've pinpointed that as the time that you thought, wow, there's a real player here, and I'm privileged to be watching them sort of in their home country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the real joy of watching South American football, not just in Argentina, is that really being able to see players before they make that move. And I think over the last few years, I mean, we'll talk about, as you mentioned, that Julián Álvarez, I think is probably definitely in that bracket. But the one previous would probably be Lautaro Martinez, who anyone who was in Argentina was aware of him even before he'd made his Racing Club senior debut. Was a guy who had a lot of hype around him. So he was one of those players that when you'd seen him playing for the youth teams, when you'd seen him playing for the Argentine national team youth sides, you kind of immediately thought, this guy looks a little bit special. But over the course of time that I've been here, there's been a lot of players that you'd probably put into that bracket of they look very, very good at a young age. They come into the senior football and immediately look good, and you think this guy's going to go on and make a big name for himself in Europe and potentially be a key figure for the Argentine national team going forward. So for every Lautaro Martinez, there's been 10 other players like Emmanuel Mamana, who is now back at River Plate in this transfer window, but early in my days in Argentina looked as though he was going to be the cornerstone of the Argentine defence for years to come. Obviously, injury more than anything has been a problem for his career. The same probably could be said for someone like Matías Craneviter when he came into the River Plate team. Looked a tremendous prospect in that holding midfield role and has never really gone on to be anywhere near the player that most in Argentina expected. So That's always been something which I've hugely enjoyed, is seeing those type of players when they first come into senior football. And sometimes there's the difference in terms of those that take off and those that plateau to some extent.
Yeah, I suppose that is quite an exciting element to it because, I mean, as you mentioned there, Mamana and Kranovic are their two names from sort of early days of playing Football Manager. You know, they were the top billed players coming out of South America, but obviously, careers can take very different paths. And Lautaro Martinez, talking about his Racing days. I mean, the first time that I came across him was just before the Under-20 World Cup in 2017, and he was very good at that, and that was kind of where I thought, oh, maybe I should start paying a little bit more attention to Argentine football if everybody's sort of been everybody's been aware of him for a little while beforehand. But onto the players that we're going to discuss today, and you're obviously talking about Alvarez there. He's the player who's, I mean, by the time that people are listening to this, he'll probably have been announced, won't he? But looks to be heavily linked, or will be signing for Manchester City. And just sort of doing a little bit of reading up on his background and stuff. He's not in a similar way to Martinez. He's somebody who has been on plenty of European clubs' radars for quite some time. Had trials with Real Madrid prior to joining River Plate. I just wanted to get from your perspective, what type of attacker is he? Because I see that he can play out wide. He's I wouldn't say he's overly diminutive, but he's not exactly he's not a 6'6" centre forward sort of thing. If someone hasn't heard of him before and kind of was wondering what he's like in terms of his profile.
Yeah, exactly. He's not particularly big, so he's not an overly physical player, and yet has been able to illustrate very well that he can play almost up front on his own in the River Plate system. Now, obviously, as you say, there's a lot of versatility within that role, which is, I think, what will probably suit him in many ways to Manchester City, because he's more than comfortable dropping off deep to get on the ball. He's got good passing, so when players run beyond him, he can then suddenly become the man that creates those chances. He can drift into those wide areas. He can beat a man. He's good with the ball at his feet. So he's kind of played all of those roles for River Plate as he's progressed. I don't think anyone really could have quite anticipated the last year or so that he's had, because he really has just taken off. You look back to when he made his debut, Marcelo Gallardo threw him on as a late sub in the biggest game in River Plate history against Boca Juniors in the Copa Libertadores final, which I think tells you something about what the club thought of him. Because, as I say, there's no bigger game in the entire history of the club. And you can look at it as, well, it was a substitute appearance, but it's not the kind of game that you give someone some minutes for the experience. This is something which, until that final whistle goes, is blood and guts. So that gives an indication of just how highly he was thought of. And then ever since then, Marcelo Gallardo was quite cautious in how he brought him in. So we did see him playing in a number of different positions. And maybe it took him a bit longer than some people expected to become a key figure for River. And I think in some sense, that's what left you guessing, well, what is his best position? Because you used to see him come on a lot as a substitute or start in games where River were resting players. And as a result, he was sometimes being asked to play out wide a little bit or dropping off another striker. And so it got to the point when he hadn't quite cemented himself into that first team. You were asking yourself that question, well, going forward, if he's going to have a really good future at River, where does he cement himself into the team as the recognised starter? And that's why I think the last year or so has been sensational, because not only has he done that, but he's just taken it to a level that we don't really see very often, certainly from a young player in Argentina, because he's been head and shoulders above anyone else. And you look at River winning the league last season for the first time under Marcelo Gallardo, despite all the trophies that he's won as a manager, the first league title in 2021. And Julián Álvarez was just otherworldly and a guy that you were looking at and thinking he has to go to Europe as soon as possible, because he's just quite evidently above the level he's playing at. I mean, 18 goals in 21 games, more or less. Assists on top of that as well. Goals in the Copa Libertadores before that. And all types of goals as well. And as I say, he then started playing almost as a lone striker, but drifting to help out the team. He presses from the front, works really, really hard that Marcelo Gallardo demands that. And he's just rounded his game off so nicely to really look like the kind of polished footballer that you'd want to be moving from a South American club to one of the European giants that Manchester City certainly have become, even if people will scoff at the notion of them being considered giants historically, but certainly now you'd put them at the very top table of European football, and Alvarez looks like the type of talent that should be going to a club like that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning there, sort of how his versatility will lend quite handily to joining a club like Manchester City. I mean, we've heard countless times Pep Guardiola saying, I don't need to sign a centre forward, I don't need to play with a striker, that sort of thing. But obviously, Alvarez has been playing, as you mentioned, at times as sort of a lone centre forward, as the player who's finishing that final action. I mean, I think just this season or this past season alone, there's been countless goals where he scored where he's been the player getting on the end of a chance coming across from the left or the right and just tapping in, opening the instep of his foot and just guiding it past the goalkeeper. I think for a team who create chances in abundance like Manchester City, that's a match made in heaven, really, isn't it? And I mean, it's the versatility aspect as well. The fact that he's going to be able to drift out wide, in sort of the way that Manchester City build up, where they have, their three defenders, Rodri as a holding midfielder, and you've got five across sort of the five across the width of the pitch, spread evenly. That he can interchange with maybe one of the wide players who will then go into a central position. There's lots of possibilities for how he could be utilized. And I mean, you touched on the statistics behind his 2021 season with River. 18 goals, 21 games more or less, as you mentioned, averaging a goal every 88 minutes, which is just ridiculous for anybody in any league, because that's a tremendous undertaking. But across all competitions, as you mentioned with the Libertadores as well, 24 goals in 46 games across all comps, and as well, he was into double figures for assists. I think he got 6 in the league and a handful in other competitions. So, it's showing that he can be a link player as well. He's not simply just a finisher. And again, that comes back to the versatility aspect. And for anybody who is looking for what Alvarez is capable of, I would recommend, from somebody who had not watched an awful lot of him, to go and watch his brace in the Super Clasico against Boca Juniors from earlier in 2021. And I think that was it the first goal in that game, Peter, which was just an absolutely rasping effort from long range. And you think this is the same guy who's just a complete fox in the 6-yard box, but he's able to turn and hit one like that.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the aspects which he certainly developed and improved on. But you are now looking, as I said before, as someone who is a lot more complete, because he is now scoring all types of goals. Because you mentioned that goal, you can argue maybe Rossi, the Boca goalkeeper, could have done better with that long range effort, but he does have that shooting from distance ability. He scores he's a very good finisher one-on-one. He finds spaces in the penalty area. He's quite predatory now as well. I think when you look back to some of his other goals this season, he scored 4, for example, against Patronato in the league. And at least 2 of them, he's just very alert to goalkeeper spilling shots that are coming in from the edge of the box. And he's the first on the scene there to apply the finishing touch. He scored a few with his head, even though he said he's not a very big guy, but he just has that good movement around the penalty area. So there is a variety to his goals that he's scoring. He can score off both feet as well. So anywhere around the penalty box, on the edge of the penalty box, he's shown himself to be a real danger for River. And I think you make a good point as well about the similarities as well between how River often look to attack teams and Manchester City do, in terms of the fullbacks getting round the outside to provide the width. A lot of the crosses that come into the box are actually low along the ground, and it's all based around the movement really then of those players that getting into the 6-yard box, into the penalty area. And it's where Alvarez has really thrived, because he has that sort of Aguero-esque movement at times of a sort of, attacking the near post, just getting that yard in front of his marker to be able to apply that first time finish, or just peeling off to the back post and just finding himself suddenly in space, even though defenders are immediately aware of he should be the player they're marking, and yet he still manages to find the space. So there's those definite similarities there that have grown over time with some of the finishing that we've seen Aguero do for years at Manchester City, even though I'd be hesitant to kind of say he's kind of just an immediate replacement for Sergio Agüero. But yeah, he's started scoring all manner of goals, and I think it's just a player that just so exciting with how he can link play but also score goals. He's also now heavily involved in the national team. I think if he continues his form going into this year with River, he'll obviously be there until at least June. Who knows if he'll be allowed to remain there until the end of the year. You'd expect him, if that's the case, to be in Lionel Scaloni's squad for the World Cup. And then, when you're at his age and you're already in the national team and already around those players that Argentina boast up front, then I think, again, it just shows you the regard that he's held in Argentina and the kind of talent he is.
I mean, you're mentioning there Sergio Agüero, and it's an obvious link to make, given that it's Manchester City. It's a small but punchy centre forward of the same nationality, sort of making that move at a similar age to Agüero. In terms of comparing the two, I mean, while there are similarities in terms of the movement inside the penalty area, would you say that there's? I mean, it would be incredibly reductive to say that yes, he's the direct replacement, because it's simply not the case. Manchester City have evolved without Aguero in the past few seasons. When his influence has maybe waned a little bit over those past 18 months. But are there similarities that you can see from sort of Aguero's Aguero's beginning of his career when he was still in Argentina compared to Alvarez's 2021 with River?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think arguably you'd make that point that Alvarez is arguably, at least, the most exciting player since Aguero, and I even put Lautaro Martinez, who I mentioned before, in that bracket. Purely because I think the level that Alvarez got to on a consistent basis over 2021 probably does put him above where we saw Lautaro performing for Racing. I mean, he was plucked away from Racing pretty quickly by Inter Milan. So maybe it was just the fact that we didn't quite see that consistent level as we've seen with Alvarez. But that's where we are putting him in that kind of bracket. The player that Aguero was when he burst onto the scene as a teenager at Independiente was something which was hugely exciting. A guy that was so good at such a young age that people were watching him thinking he could go on and be the best player in the world. Now, obviously, his old friend from the youth sides, Lionel Messi, without question, takes that honour. But Aguero himself went on and had a very, very, very good career, which probably is a little, to some extent, undervalued in Argentina, just because of the fact that maybe he didn't ever quite reach those levels with the national team, and barring the Copa America last year, that it wasn't the era of dominance that I think many hoped for Argentina. However, Alvarez certainly you'd put in the same bracket in terms of his talent, and there's certain similarities that have developed over the last year or so in terms of their instincts in the penalty area. So I think it is one for Manchester City fans to be very excited about, even if they do need to approach it with a little bit of patience, because of course it's a young player coming from South America, and as we know, he's going to be staying at River Plate for a little while longer, and then it will be a case of how he adapts to the English game, how he adapts to a new coach, a new team. But certainly, when you speak to coaches at River who have worked with him from a very young age, they don't seem to have any doubts that he'll adapt. I mean, I remember speaking to some of his coaches at River over the last few months, and talking about some of the things that had come up in the press when they talked about. I think you mentioned before when trials at Boca Juniors. I think he also had a trial at Argentinos Juniors. And in the end ended up going back to his hometown in Cordoba, and there'd been talk about him not really settling in Buenos Aires. But when I spoke to coaches at River about that, they said that there was never any issue at all when he came to Buenos Aires with River. Immediately settled in to their youth teams, quickly made friends with other members of the River side that are still with River now, like Benjamin Rolheiser. And so for them, it's never been a problem of the thinking that he won't settle once he moves on to another team. So just felt like I should put that one out there just in case people were slightly concerned about a young South American player moving to England.
No, I think it's a concern which people might rightly have. It's as you mentioned with Mamana and Kranovic previously, it's there's no guarantee, is there, that players coming over and making such a hugely consequential change, not only to their professional life but their personal life as well. Yeah, as you say, he won't be coming over immediately. He'll be staying with River for a little while, at least until the end of the 2021-22 season in Europe, that is. But yeah, should be an exciting one. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing him sort of week in, week out in the Premier League when the time comes. On to the next player on our list. And we're going to go from an attacker straight to a defender. And it's César Ibańez, who plays for Huracán. He's a left back, 22 years old. And he was, a player that, whilst I was sort of pouring through the data on Liga Profesional from this season, he was somebody who repeatedly stood out. And I was wondering whether it was perhaps a symptom of how Huracán play, that, Ibañez's defensive numbers were really pronounced, because I was thinking, it is easier to post good defensive numbers in a league which is more transitional than the majority of Europe's top divisions, because naturally the ball is to and fro from between the two teams more often. But he's a very, very big tackler in terms of the volume that that he is tackling, and also the success rate. So that was, to me, that was something which, over the course of, I think it's something like 15 or 20 games that he played, that if he was able to maintain that. So that was something which definitely stood out. And Peter, I wanted to get your sort of expertise on Ibañez, because besides looking up a few clips on Instat, then there wasn't a great deal that I knew about him before we decided to discuss him.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think you hit on something there in terms of the team that he's playing for, as well as the nature of the Argentine league and how the game is played. I think for a team like Huracán, who have been struggling, haven't been particularly impressive, I think it's probably in part down to the fact that they are doing a lot of defending. And Ibañez is a very tenacious kind of fullback who gets up and down the pitch, a lot of energy. I think as a result is probably why he ends up making a lot of tackles. But certainly at 22 years of age is one of interest. I think when we're talking about ceilings, and we've just gone from Julián Álvarez, who we're talking about as potentially having the highest ceiling that you could put on a young player in South America, I think with Ibañez, we're more likely looking at the kind of player that could potentially either get a move within Argentina to one of the bigger clubs, or, as you mentioned right at the start, Joe, in terms of one of the newer routes out of Argentina to Major League Soccer. But that's the kind of player we're probably talking about with César Ibañez. And it will be interesting this season just to see if he can maintain those kind of numbers, whether he can add a little bit more maybe going forward. That will, of course, depend not just on him, but on Huracán as a team. But yeah, certainly someone that could be interesting to keep an eye on going into this new season.
I suppose that's a good opportunity to discuss the exit route to Major League Soccer then, because we've seen countless players do it from South America, not just Argentina, over recent seasons. I know a couple, it must have been quite a while ago now, that we were discussing Brenner's move to, I think it was Minnesota United, from Sao Paulo in Brazil. And you do see these players make the move to MLS, and we'll get on to another player who we've got in this list shortly, who is going to be making that move as well. What is it about MLS that makes it sort of a good testing ground?
Well, I think more than anything now, what it is just a financial disparity. I mean, what we're looking at in Argentina now is, especially post-pandemic, clubs that are really, really struggling for money, and that goes all the way up to some of the biggest clubs in Argentina. So they're having to sell players, and they're having to sell some of their best young players, really just to anyone who'd be willing to pay a decent amount of money, even if it's under the real valuation of the player. And from a player's perspective, equally, they're looking at situations at a lot of these clubs where they're either not getting paid or they're behind on their getting paid. They're getting paid in Argentine peso, a currency which isn't particularly good and seems to be worsening, certainly against the dollar. So it's an opportunity for a lot of these young players to really change their lives and take these moves which may not excite people looking in from the outside. I know I get a lot of comments when players move from Argentina to MLS and people reply saying, "Oh, why is he making that move? It's such a waste of his career. He should be going to Europe." And always kind of think, well, it's not really that simple, and it's certainly not as easy for us to sit here on the sidelines and tell these young players who quite often come from very, very poor backgrounds that it's the wrong move their career, because here they are getting offered a very good contract from an up-and-coming league with the security that goes with that. You're not going to get any of those problems in MLS in terms of, they haven't been paid for 6 months. Security issues just in terms of their living arrangements and what have you. So it has become increasingly attractive for young players. And I think the big question mark over recent years is if they can start more often than not still selling those players to Europe and giving them an opportunity to say, look, you can even come and play in Major League Soccer for 1-2 seasons and still get your move to Europe. Then it would become even more desirable to young players in Argentina. And I think that's where we are heading, which is making it all the more difficult for Argentine clubs, because we ordinarily in the past had that traditional route of European clubs swooping in for the big talents in Argentina. And I think now we have a model where we still have those European scouts looking for those type of Julián Álvarez talents in Argentina, but we also have a huge swathe of MLS scouts operating in South America, not just looking to compete with Europe for those players, but also looking for players that maybe aren't quite at that level, maybe someone like César Ibańez, and saying, well, he's not someone who's necessarily going to go and play in Europe, but he'd be a very good fullback for our league. So he could come in and not be on one of their big contracts. He's not going to go and take up one of the designated player slots at any club, but can go in there and do a very good job for an MLS club. And then take into account they're also going to be looking at players who maybe have got a little bit older, but are still performing at a very high level in Argentina or South America, no longer really maybe on the radar for European clubs, but can go there at 25, 26 years of age and hit the ground running and be a big star in MLS. Someone like Gustavo Bo, for example, who didn't make that move to Europe, was scoring goals for fun for Racing, and then made that move to MLS and has continued scoring goals with New England Revolution. So it's just opened up a lot more players that are maybe able to get those moves overseas, and I think it's only going to keep increasing over the coming seasons.
Yeah, there were a lot of conditional factors to take on board really there, and especially sort of the personal, living arrangements, that sort of thing. They will always, they'll always have an impact on a player's decision on whether they're going to go somewhere else. On to our third player. We're going to stay with defenders, and it's an interesting one. I think we've picked a good list here in terms of the variety, in terms of position, and also the different professional situations. And it's Nazareno Colombo, who is another 22-year-old, but he's owned by Estudiantes, centre half, but spent the last couple of months of the 2021 season on loan with Defensa y Justicia. And it was quite, having a look at sort of his record with Defensa y Justicia, it was quite impressive. They were defeated just once in their last 15 league games, in which Colombo played every single minute. He helped them to 6 clean sheets, including a 0-0 with Boca Juniors on his first start in that loan deal. And from just watching a few clips of his, it seems as though he reads the game quite well, intercepts quite well. Doesn't mess about with it too much. He's very big on his clearances, which I suppose is very effective if you're a lot more focused on your defensive fundamentals, your traditional style. And I mean, in sort of the crib sheet, I've asked sort of, would you say he's a cat and standoffish, silky in possession, or a dog in terms of being a front foot, aggressive central defender when it comes to his overall style? From the the few clips that I've seen, I've kind of got an idea of what you might say, but I was wondering whether you had a different view of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would have said immediately that he was very much front foot, aggressive kind of centre back when he was coming through with Estudiantes. And there is definitely still that element to his game. I think that's still his strength in terms of his physicality. However, I think Defensa y Justicia are an interesting club, and they tend to buy or do their business, whether it's on loan or whether it's permanent deals, very astutely. And then bringing in Nazareno Colombo last season was another great bit of business. As you said, he came straight in, immediately slotted into the first team and did very well. And I think one of the things that perhaps he's been able to show a little bit more during that time is the fact that he's actually not bad in possession as well. Because Defensa y Justicia are a team that look to play out from the back, very much so, sometimes to their detriment, because they stick to that principle, even under real pressure, and teams do try and put them under pressure, put pressure on the goalkeeper, put pressure on the centre-backs when they're trying to play out from the back. So there isn't really much room for someone who's hopeless at doing that. So Colombo's had to adjust to that side of the game. Sebastian Becasese is the manager, who was the assistant of Jorge Sampaoli for a long period of time, very much a coach in the mould of Sampaoli, and of course going further back to Bielsa, that lineage there. So that gives you an indication of kind of what he would expect from his centre backs. And Nazareno Colombo has done that. I mean, Defensa y Justicia had a terrific end to 2021. And as I say, they're a very interesting club because the start of the year, when Hernan Crespo was manager, they won the Copa Sudamericana, their first major trophy. And it was by no means really the tip of the iceberg, because they've been able to, although they didn't win any further trophies in the rest of the year, they were still able to continue to be very, very competitive in Argentina. They were playing in the Copa Libertadores at the same time at the start of the year, which is maybe why their league form was a little bit indifferent, having to balance between the two. And it was really during the worst period of the pandemic. They were losing players left, right and centre all the time to positive COVID cases. But the second half of 2021, when they really had that settled 11, Becasese had a little bit more time in this, which is his third spell as manager of the club. And they began to click. They began to figure out their team, the structure of the team, how they were going to play. And they really did become formidable. They ended up finishing, I think, second in the league. So it just goes to show the kind of run they went on towards the end of the season. And although it was maybe the likes of Walter Bo that really caught the eye, the more attacking players, huge credit has to go to the defence as well. Nazareno Colombo, Adonis Frias, one of their homegrown players that plays alongside him as well, did a great job in playing their role in how well Defensa y Justicia finished the year. So I think he is an interesting player. I think Defensa y Justicia have done a deal with Estudiantes to keep him at the club this season as well, which I think is the best place for him. So yeah, at 22 years of age, it will be interesting to see just how much more he can develop under a very good coach like Becasese.
Yeah, I mean that's news to me with him being able to stay at Defensa y Justicia, and I mean as well, I think it's kind of just a lesson that based on a few, I mean less than one games watching, you shouldn't really put somebody in a box in terms of their style. Bit of a lesson for myself there, but yeah, I mean it's good to hear that he's obviously developed the way that he's been able to play, or the way that he's his style while he's been out on loan. And obviously for any young player, the best thing they can get is regular minutes, which, whatever level that may be, to continue developing and continue testing themselves. So at a team who are doing as well as Defensa y Justicia are, then yeah, I think that's a positive thing. And Colombo is definitely a player who I think I really had no knowledge of, but now I'll keep a closer eye on. Onto our final player list. And it's somebody who other people in Europe might be more familiar with, given the fact that he's quite young. He's an attacking player, and attacking players are always seem to be more attractive to sort of the transfer gossip columns, which is quite topical, given that today, when we're recording, is transfer deadline day. But it's Alan Velasco, who is a 19-year-old winger, stroke attacking midfielder, who plays for Independiente. And played roughly around 2,000 league minutes in 2021, which was one of the highest tallies for a teenager in Argentina's top flight. And when you think of sort of a flighty, small Argentine player, with all the hallmarks of your traditional South American player, Velasco does tend to tick a lot of those boxes. He's fouled a lot because of his speed and his directness. I think I've got down here, he attempts 8 dribbles per 90. Not all of them successful, but at 19, to be showing that level of self-belief is obviously very encouraging at a good level as well. He's a creative player. As far as I've seen, a good link player in the final third. Not just a direct threat on the counter attack, even though that is perhaps where he is best, or at least the most striking and impactful. And I think, as with any teenage player, they're going to be, little nicks to his game which could require improvement. I think from what I've seen, shot location's probably one of them, being that, he doesn't take, his shots are not taken on from optimal locations, which is probably why his goals tally is considerably less than the likes of somebody like Alvarez, who is getting a lot of his chances probably about 10 or 15 yards closer to the goal. But in terms of him being an effective player, he's very striking. He's somebody who I think it would be interesting to see whether he would make a good transition to Europe. But I'm sure, as you'll mention, Peter, I think he's somebody who'd definitely make a good switch to Major League Soccer.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when we're talking about big talents again coming out of Argentina, Alvarez took it to another level this season. But just before maybe he really hit that sweet spot in terms of his form, you'd probably make the argument that Velasco was right there with him in terms of the big talent at the time in Argentina. If you're going to put 3, I think it would be Velasco, Alvarez, and Thiago Almada. And I think it's telling, and going back to what we were talking about earlier with MLS, that Thiago Almada is all but signed with Atlanta United. They're just waiting to confirm that, really. And Alan Velasco, as we're talking about, looks as well, everything signed for him to sign with FC Dallas. So a sign of the times that we're talking about 2 of the big talents coming out of Argentina going to the US. But Velasco, still, you definitely put him in that bracket. I think it's a little bit of a disappointment for Independiente supporters, for supporters of Argentine football, that a talent like Velasco maybe is going to Major League Soccer and it isn't making the direct jump to Europe, because I think that's what he's shown he's probably capable of. As you said, he's only 19 years of age. He's been playing in an Independiente side who have been very, very disjointed. I mean, I think there's a big point there to make about the difference between the situation Velasco's been having to develop in and Julián Álvarez. Álvarez really has been given the perfect platform in a sense of having a terrific coach in Marcelo Gallardo, a settled River Plate structure that he's able to fit into, have time to develop into. And on the flip side of that, Alan Velasco's been an Independiente side that since making his debut under Ariel Holan at 16, he's gone through maybe 4 coaches. Independiente have changed styles. They've really, it's been a bit of a mess on and off the pitch. Off the pitch being the financial situation, which is leading to why he's moving for what is really a knockdown price to Major League Soccer. But on the pitch, a mess as well. And it hasn't been easy for someone of his age, who should really still be finding his feet in the senior game, and is instead being at times the guy that Independiente have looked to for inspiration. I mean, you talking there as well, Joe, about some of his shot locations and these type of things, and maybe not scoring as many goals. But it at times has been a little bit desperate from Independiente, because we've seen a team, even a team of their stature, giving the ball to this teenager and just hoping that he can conjure up some magic. I mean, he does have that in his locker. He's got terrific ability with the ball at his feet, a great dribble, as you mentioned, the number of dribbles that he attempts per game, even if they're not all successful. But it's because he does a lot of the time shoulder that creative burden for Independiente, and he's constantly trying things. He's always trying to fashion chances for other people or create space for himself, even if he's some distance from goal to take on shots. And he has been really the one bright spark for Independiente in what's been otherwise a pretty gloomy couple of years. So it's a big loss for them that he'll be leaving in this window, and a massive boost for Major League Soccer to be taking a player of his profile.
You mentioned a knockdown price. I saw reports which were sort of around $7 million, so around £5 million or something like that, 5.5 million euros. I mean, to me, from coming from a perspective where I didn't really have a great deal of knowledge on the financial situation in Argentina, is that a surprise, or is that just a sign of the times?
It's a sign of the times at Independiente. I think if he
Okay.
had been at Boca or River, I think they would have been able to drive that price up a bit more, even though they too have their own financial concerns. I think Alvarez obviously going for much more than that, but he has pushed on a lot more over the last season and is now in the Argentina setup. So there are other factors there to why Julián Álvarez is going for far more. But regardless, I think the Independiente situation has dictated that they really are in a position, they've got huge numbers of debts with other teams from transfers that they haven't paid. So until they do business with those debts or work out some sort of financing, they're unable to bring players in. So that just gives them the idea of how bad they are financially, and why any amount of dollars coming immediately in will go a long way to helping the club. Regardless of that situation, I think supporters will still look at it and say this is a terrible deal that we're losing the best young player the club's created in many years for, as you said, around $7 million, and maybe even less than that initially, because I think some of it's tied into some objectives. Because although I don't think anyone expected him to go for his release clause, which was in excess of $20 million, I think they were still hoping it would be at least double figures. And I think had it been European clubs coming in for him, then maybe it would have been. The fact that those offers didn't really come, or when they did, it was very much teams just trying to pounce on the fact that they knew Independiente were in financial problems, has led to them in the end having to just take the best of what's probably been a series of pretty bad offers. But it's just a massive coup for Dallas and the MLS, because for an amount of money which doesn't necessarily break the bank, they're getting a player who is ready-made to go into the starting 11 and make a difference in MLS, but also crucially, if he can kick on and consistently perform in MLS, could potentially go on and get them a hefty profit if they were to sell him 1 or 2 years down the line to European football.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous upside on Velasco, especially for the fee or the reported fee that Dallas are gonna land him for, and as well, it's maybe a potential interesting little tidbit is the fact that Dallas do share a sort of a strategic partnership with Bayern Munich. Now, I'm not saying that it's a conveyor belt and Velasco will be playing for Bayern at some point in the near future, but we've seen the likes of Chris Richards go over from Dallas. We've seen various other Dallas young players train at Sassuolo Strasse with Bayern. So, yeah, it's by no means impossible that we might see him in Europe at maybe in the Bundesliga in the future. But yeah, as you mentioned, at 19, very big upside on him as a player. Very exciting. Obviously, if you're Independiente, it's a bit of a kick in the teeth. But I suppose money makes the world go round, and when a team from MLS come in with 5 or 6 million pounds, euros, dollars, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be difficult to turn down when you're in arrears to quite a few other clubs, as you mentioned. But yeah, this has been the Scouted Football podcast, and a deep dive on a few interesting players, to say the least, in Argentina. A few varied players, some who will be making names for themselves in the States, some who will be making a name for themselves in potentially the Premier League. If Julián Álvarez kicks on with Manchester City. And yeah, I think of the names that we've picked, Peter, I think we'll be hearing a bit more of them. And for those of you who are listening who hadn't really heard of them before or wanted to get to know a little bit more about them, then hopefully they'll be on your radar for a little while longer. But all that's left to do now is to say thank you to Peter. Thank you for coming on and giving up your time. Where can people engage with your work, find your work, chat to you about Argentine players?
Yeah, just go to the Twitter at Galatzo Argentino. And yeah, there'll plenty of talk about those young players, plenty of other young players, and sort of anything that goes on in Argentina, really. So yeah, be sure to follow me there and leave a message, and I'm sure we can get chatting about Argentine football. Any excuse.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to put the Galatzo Argentino in the description for this episode if you want to head over and follow Peter on Twitter. But yeah, this has been the Scouted Pod. Thank you very much for joining me on this one. We'll be back in the next couple of weeks with further episodes. And yeah, I've been Joe Donoghue. Stay safe. Take care. Bye for now.